Our presentation today is the success of failure, and we are joined today by Gavin Woltjer. Gavin is the library director for the Billings, Montana Public Library. When not held hostage in a good book, he enjoys exploring the wilds of Montana with his wife, Raina, and their 3 children. His research interests include data analytics, library leadership, economic development in libraries, archives and record management, and librarian as public historian. Welcome, Gavin.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. I hope that some of the information I share with you today that you are able to implement it right away. There's going to be a lot of information thrown at you over the next 45, 50 minutes. The most important thing to do is to think of 1 or 2 things that I share with you today and start implementing them. Maybe not all of it. That could be a little overwhelming. But a few weeks ago, I was asked to provide some questions for you all to think about before we get into some of the more meat and potatoes of this conversation. And I just want to go over these questions real briefly because I want you to think about them as we share this information. The first one is, why do we fear failure? This is going to be a big question that we ask right at the get-go, and it kind of has a thread throughout this presentation. The second is, how is failure a benefit for our own personal growth? And that can be both in your professional life and in your private life. Third is, why do we make the narrative that every failure is catastrophic? Fourth, think about a time you failed and why did you fail? What were the variables in this equation of failure? Chances are you didn't fail entirely. You failed in one small aspect, but that one small aspect eclipsed the possible success of whatever you were trying to do. And finally, how do you address failure on an individual level? And how do you address failure when part of a team? 2 very different approaches to what failure is. So if you were waiting for this presentation to begin, there was a great quote that came across the screen, and it said, "If you learn from defeat, you really haven't lost." And that's by Zig Ziglar. And that is a great segue into today's presentation, because the success of failure is really all about tenacity or mental fortitude. Spoiler alert, we're all going to fail. Whatever you do going forward, at some point, possibly even today, you're going to fail. What you do with that failure, how you take that feedback, how you learn from that, truly will set the tone of what that failure means in the bigger complexity of the endeavor. So we work hard to do the things we think will make us better, but we forget to focus on the things that might be sabotaging our efforts. And that's where we have to really begin asking ourselves, why did I fail? Well, there could be a whole host of reasons, okay? Personally, I think failure is the most powerful teaching tool one has to make themselves better. It is one of the most advantageous tools in our toolbox if we know how to use that tool. If we don't know how to use that tool, failure can be that big monster that kind of lurks in the shadows, or telling us that whatever idea you had, it was not a good idea, or you're not smart enough to execute the idea, or whatever the case may be. If you can learn to use this tool, it will be great for your future endeavors. So I want to read a poem real quick, very short, called Self-Pity by D.H. Lawrence. And this poem goes like this. I never saw a wild thing sorry for itself. A bird will fall frozen dead from a bough without ever having felt sorry for itself. Now that seems kind of like a little weird poem. It's called Self-Pity to start off this presentation. But really, failure is one of those monsters, those big obstacles that if we allow it to, it feeds into our self-pity. It feeds into our negativity. It feeds into a horrible narrative that ultimately you will not want as your story. It's also something I want you to think about. In the animal kingdom, just alone in the animal kingdom, think of all the animals that have to go on a hunt, let's say, in order to survive. They're not always successful. Do they sit down and just say, well, you know what, I'm just going to wait until room service comes and gives me a meal? Obviously not. Put these numbers, here's some numbers for you to put into perspective. A cheetah is only successful 50% of the time. A leopard, 40% of the time. Lions, 25% of the time. Wolves, who hunt in teams and packs, are only successful 14% of the time, and a polar bear is only successful 10% of the time. Now, we're not a polar bear, we're not a cheetah, we're not a wolf. We're able to do things differently. But we can't imagine us being perfect all the time. Every time, if we have an idea and we use the metaphor of a hunt, every one of our hunts is not going to be successful. So if you were in a presentation where we are face-to-face, this is the moment where I would ask you by show of hands, who has never failed before? Chances are, no hand would go up. We've all failed. We've failed in some aspect, in the little minuscule detail of something to the great big failure. But really, it's how have we dealt with this failure? The definition of failure is lack of success or the omission of expected or required action. But we have to look at something else, and that's what is it that we were expecting? Maybe our expectation was wrong. Maybe we didn't fail in the bigger aspect of whatever it was, and it was just a smaller failure. This is my library in Billings, Montana. We turned 5 years old this past January. This building comes with a lot of expectation. It's a LEED Platinum building. We service a community about 170,000 people, and we welcome about 410,000 people a year to this facility. We have over 500 meetings. We have over 350,000 computer sessions a year, and we circulate just under 1 million resources a year. To say anything about this building is this. This is a box of failure. Everything we do is not perfect. And that's okay, because we're constantly learning, we're constantly reshaping, redefining, reorganizing what our role, what our place is within our community. But we have to ask ourselves from the get-go, are we willing to fail in order to learn this information? So we have to start by asking ourselves a really hard question. Why are we afraid to fail? Well, there's 3 real big categories that I would argue why we're afraid to fail. We're afraid to fail because there's a new perception that comes to ourself when failure happens. The second one is there's this new perception of skills or expertise or our education or our position, title, station comes into question when we fail. As a director, if I fail, there's a third area that has a new perception to it, and that's of my organization. If I'm failing and I'm not learning from this failure, all of a sudden there's this new narrative out there about my abilities to run my organization. Well, while all this is true, it's not nearly as big, it's not nearly as detrimental as we think it is. So why do we fail? Well, there's a couple reasons for it. Sometimes we fail because our own egos get in the way. We think we have such a great idea that no matter what type of feedback we get, no matter what type of insight someone provides, our ego overshadows that conversation. Sometimes we fail because we are not good listeners. And I'll admit, listening is not one of my strong points. I have to really work at being an active listener. And knowing this helps me overcome failure. Sometimes it's failure to plan. We have an idea, we don't really know where to go with it, and instead of developing, instead of allowing this idea to mature, we just push it out into the world, and we think it's going to be great, and it falls flat on its face. Now, All of these reasons for failure are opportunities for growth, opportunities for us to get a better insight into understanding where the failure comes from. I'm pretty sure all of you have the interests of your library at heart. You all want to see your library succeed. But if we're constantly worried about our own ego, or we're not listening, or we're not getting that feedback, or we're not planning, it's hard to find success. See, failure needs to be embraced, and it needs to be embraced from leadership. Now, I would also ask you, if we were face to face, which one of you is a leader in your library? And that's a trick question, because leadership doesn't depend upon station or title. Every one of you should be able to say, I am a leader in my library. Now, the leadership's going to look differently. It's going to have different responsibilities and roles associated with it. But regardless, if you're a page up to the executive director, you're a leader in the facility. Addressing failure starts by reframing the failure. It starts with leadership. If you come in and there's a failure that just happens, and you come in angry and afraid or worried, that tone alone is going to set how you address failure. Whereas if you come in enthusiastic or optimistic or curious on why failure happened, you're going to address it much differently. Furthermore, if you take ownership of failure, in my shop, my staff knows I am not going to be disappointed in failure, ever. My disappointment will come as if we don't learn from that failure, if we don't take the time to articulate the variables that failed so that we better understand where this failure came from. There has to be this ownership of failure, both maybe as an individual and as a team. And that looks vastly different depending on if it is an individual or a team failure. And we're going to get to that in just a second. But mostly, how is this failure communicated? Is it a blame game? Is there silence associated with it? Or is it embraced and discussed and explored? Is it actually examined and studied for a greater benefit? Once we adjust our thinking to failure, once we reframe it, our thoughts and our behaviors and our emotions are much different regarding that failure. All of us, again, we fail, and we're going to continue to fail. In reality, there's only one person who knows all the answers, and that's him, Mr. Ken Jennings. In 2004, Jennings won 74 consecutive Jeopardy games before he too was defeated. Now, the defeat, we can maybe tenuously say he failed. He failed to win a match on his 75th appearance. But his total earnings on Jeopardy, $3.19 million. Now, if we reframe this failure into the 3.19 million, none of us, I think, would say, oh, that's a failure. It's all about the reframing. It's all about how we look at the failure, the situation, how we go about articulating this failure. Sometimes it's going to be beneficial. Sometimes it's going to be harder to articulate, but we have to try because that's how we're going to understand. As the leader of my organization, I have to be able to make sure that this failure, whatever it is understood by my staff, is understood by the political bodies that I partner with, is understood by my community partners, but also understood by the public. Now, not every failure needs to be articulated through each one of those mediums, but I should be able to answer the questions of why something failed to any one of those populaces. I love this quote by Dennis Waitley. Failure should be our teacher, not our undertaker. Failure is delay, not defeat. It is a temporary detour, not a dead end. Failure is something we can avoid only by saying nothing, doing nothing, and being nothing. There are some great key words in that quote. Teacher, delay, not defeat, temporary detour. Now, I would love it if any of you are so bold to write in the chat box if this is your library's motto. We say nothing, do nothing, and be nothing for our community. Now, if that is your library's motto, we need to have a different conversation. Chances are your mission, your motto, your goal of your organization, it has failure built into it. Because there's no way we're going to be able to succeed on all fronts all the time. We have to sometimes take a stand about things. We have to sometimes challenge ourselves by doing a new program, by inviting a new populace in, by speaking out. Those things come with failure. And that's okay. Because in our field, sometimes, yes, we play it safe, and sometimes there's strategies behind it. But if failure is driving our strategy, if failure is the reason why we don't grow, the reason why we don't expand our services, incorporate new people, infuse new ideas, then you're in the wrong field. Because libraries are built for failure. They're built so that we can understand why we failed, so that we can learn how better to succeed. It's hard to constantly reframe like this. You have to be proactive. You have to be intentional every single day to reframe failure in this capacity. So if we rethink failure, and we think that failure is not just part of the equation for success, but it's a necessary destination to success, it might look something like this. So here we have what is typically looked upon as failure. Success is a one-way street or two-way between success and ourselves. Failure, the same way. We're caught in this middle, in this storm of either success or failure. But what if it doesn't look like that? What if we actually have a different approach to it? And we say ourselves, we have this idea. We have this want, this need. But we don't know how to go about doing it at first. Well, guess what? We fail. And this might be a loop for a long time. But we're constantly gathering data. We're constantly gathering experience. We're constantly gathering insight so that when we keep on plugging away, we keep on trying, we actually pass through failure to success. Now, we can do this in different ways. We can intentionally increase our failure rate because we're not believers of being nothing or doing nothing or saying nothing philosophy. We're actually going to go into a situation knowing, you know what, I might fail here, and that's okay. Because this failure will lead me to a better understanding. This failure is going to teach me something so that 5 months, year, maybe 2 years down the road, it doesn't matter what the timeline is. You're going to be better informed in order to get to that success point. It might be that we have to celebrate failure and we own it. And we say, man, that was the greatest train wreck I've ever been part of. Now, what did we learn? It might be that our failure, because it's on this loop, mind you, it has to be shared. so that I can tell you, you can tell somebody else, down and down and down the line of communication, what this failure means, how to avoid it, what did we learn, and it's this constantly evolving thing. It might be that through this failure, because again, we're on this loop, we experienced new opportunities, new ideas came into play. And now not only have we not failed per se, but now we have new offshoots to explore. And maybe the original idea will never come to fruition, but we have this new bank of ideas that have come about because we failed. Maybe it's, hey, I need to stop berating myself, and you have this new self-introspection, this new self-understanding that maybe this failure is happening because I don't believe in the idea. Or, and this is okay, you admit to yourself, I am not the one to head this idea. My skill set is not equally matched with this idea. Maybe it's we realize our failure is because we're confusing success with perfection. Perfection doesn't exist, ladies and gentlemen. I just want to say that right now. And I will say it is better to be imperfect than to be stagnant and do nothing because we fear failure. We need to be ready to rethink and retool and regroup and then re-engage with the idea. I'm a big believer that mistakes do not define us. They are part of our bigger definition. And as long as we're learning, as long as we're moving the pieces down the board, that's okay. We need those mistakes to get to success. Maybe this failure is we're not being consistent. We're not approaching things the way that we ought to be. Maybe it's we're failing because we're not incorporating people. And so this endless loop is constantly happening because we're not doing anything differently. Finally, I think we have to be on this road. We have to pass through failure because the enemy of success is not failure. It's the fear of failure. So as we go through this, and we've learned all of these things, and we have all these new insights and ideas, we have incorporation of new thoughts. When we fail, as an individual and as part of a team, now we have to understand that failure. And so when we do that, we have to learn from the failure individually and collectively. But first, I urge you, if you are part of a team that fails at something, don't come together right away and start unpacking that failure. Think about it on an individual level first. Make a list, because chances are you're going to think of areas that you failed that your partner, your team may not agree with you, and vice versa. You're going to see an area of failure that they see as an area of success, possibly. Well, why? Find that understanding. And then identify the components that failed and study them. Again, chances are when you fail at something, the whole entirety of the idea didn't fail. There were certain variables that failed. Identify these areas. Study them so that you have a better understanding of what you think could be done differently. And then make adjustments and try again. You only fail completely if you do nothing with the feedback that you get from the original failure. And the beauty of this process is you repeat it over and over again so that you find success from the failure. Now, this is laborious at times. This takes a lot of mental energy, a lot of emotional energy. It takes time, and it takes commitment. I'm a geophysical engineer by trade. I'm what you could kind of consider an accidental librarian. And as an engineer, I love unpacking a problem. I even go on as far as to say, I think the greatest love poem to mankind is the scientific process. Because through this diagram right here, there's not a problem that can't be overcome. It might take thousands of iterations through this process. But if you stick with it, if you keep plugging away, if you address the adversity of failure through critical thinking and professionalism, creative thinking, collaboration, lifelong learning, flexibility, insight, feedback, open communication, everything, I truly believe, can be solved. But it takes time to become comfortable with this process. The biggest spoiler that I can give all of you is this. Failure is a part of our reality, and it's going to happen. Every idea you have is not perfect. Every idea your team shares is not going to be perfect. And even if you have that perfect idea, every time you execute it will not be perfect. Why is that? Because as humans, we are perfectly imperfect. We're going to have our off days. Even during this presentation, there are times when I think, oh, I should have elaborated on this already, and we're a half hour into the presentation. Imperfection is our reality. Failure is part of our reality. I want to tell you a story. And for those of you who know who this handsome man is, this is Uncle Stevie, Stephen King. One of my favorite authors. And about 12 years ago, before I got into administration, I was the director of public outreach at a library in South Dakota. And I had this perfect idea. It's Halloween time. It's about, mid-October, let's say. And everyone's reading scary stories. The horror novels are flying off the shelves. We have displays of it. Everything is going perfect. And I have this wonderful idea of, you know what, we should discuss Stephen King's books and their movie adaptations. And so I go about creating this program. And I'm just psyched for it. I have all my notes. I have the food. I have the date. I have the advertisement. I have the marketing. I got this whole thing planned out. And I'm excited. And so the day of the event, October 28th, it's not Halloween. No one's out trick-or-treating. I'm ready to rock and roll. Program takes place at 7 p.m. at our library. And at 6:30, 6:40, I got everything set up. My adrenaline's already pumping. I'm jazzed for this. 7 o'clock comes. Nobody shows up. All right, no problem. People are just going to be casually late. That's all right. 7:10. Still nobody shows up. 7:30, there's nobody there. Pretty soon I'm starting to look at the food on the table going, oh my goodness, I just bought $150 worth of food for nobody. Now, the good thing is, silver lining of that is that I work in a library, so there's plenty of people that will eat the food from the staff. 7:45. Nobody's there still. Now, I'm too stubborn to say no one's going to show up. So I decided to myself, I'll wait till 8 o'clock because maybe people thought that 7 o'clock really meant 8 o'clock. And so I wait. And at 7:55, a gentleman carrying the Tommy knockers comes into the library. Now, I tell you what, it was like seeing an angel walk through the door with this wonderful halo of light around him because I was so excited. Okay, I got one person. I'll call it a success. I was doing everything I possibly could to trick myself into that, hey, I did not fail at this. And this gentleman comes up. He's been working out in the fields all day. He's a ranch hand. And I said, sir, are you here for the program? And he said, yes, I am. And he goes, I'm sorry, I was late. And I said, no worries. Let's talk. And I start just right into the presentation. I start into exactly what I shouldn't have done. And I start talking about Pet Sematary and Cujo and everything else and the movie adaptations, how it's different from the book, and I'm just going a mile a minute. And he stands there very patiently. And he puts his hand up and he says, "Son, I'm sure what you have to say is really interesting, but if you could just sign this book, I can be on my way." Now let's stop there for just a second. If you can sign this book, if you saw my picture here up in the left-hand corner, I don't look like Stephen King. He thought I was Stephen King. Now what I should have done was probably sign it and lick my wounds later, but I couldn't do that. So I had to tell him, "Sir, I'm not Stephen King." And he looked at me and he said, "Well, I guess then I have no reason being here." And he turned and left. Now that was the ultimate example of failure. See, through my whole planning process, the books, the notes, ordering the food, advertising, marketing, everything else, I forgot to do one thing. I forgot to consult the community calendar. And had I taken the time to consult the community calendar, I would have seen in our small little community that the 6 churches had combined and done a trunk or treat that evening. I'm convinced it wouldn't have mattered what program I put on or who the speaker was that night. Nobody was showing up. Now, I didn't come about this information right away. It took a couple of weeks later when I was sitting around and my boss said to me, "Why do you think it failed?" And of course, I went on the defensive right away. Well, people just, maybe they were intimidated, maybe they just don't understand literary theory or all this other garbage that I was just making excuses. And she asked me, "Well, did you look at the community calendar? Do you know what was happening that night?" No, I had no idea. And so she taught me a very valuable lesson right there. That I had succeeded in a lot of different areas of the program. Now, a lot of them were behind the scenes, right? The advertising, the marketing, the planning, the design, the writing of this lecture. But the big part, the big variable, what was going on in our community, I never addressed. I never thought about it. And then she said something very interesting. About a week before Thanksgiving, she said to me, "Why don't you try this again next year?" And I thought she was just kind of pitying me a little bit. And so I shelved it, and I thought, you know what, maybe. Well, next year rolls around, and I still have this wonderful program that I think is wonderful, at least. And I decided to try it again. But this time, I do consult with the community calendar. I do make sure I know what's happening, what are different events leading up to that week and also happening on that weekend. And we still do it on a Thursday night. And this next time, 37 people show up for this event. That was a great success. Now, I could have shelved it forever. I could have said, you know what, my ego, my pride, I'm not doing it again. I just don't have the energy. I don't want to fail again. But her reframing of the failure, her encouragement, her leadership allowed me to rethink my failure, allowed me to readdress this program. And in a way, it allowed me to have new energy, new enthusiasm for this program. Now, not every failure like this needs to be repeated. There are some times after we fail, we have to understand and accept that, you know what, this is just not an idea that's ready at this time, at this moment. And we move on. And there's nothing wrong with that. That is not quitting. That is learning. That is being honest to ourselves. But I could have very easily taken this example and said it's catastrophic. This failure will define me for the rest of my time at the library. But it didn't. See, we have to sometimes realize that with abject failure, this is the catastrophic kind of failure. This is the unrecoverable type of failure, or the permanently damaging, permanent loss type of failure. This is the type of failure that we constantly think of or we build up in our minds, which very rarely happens. I'm not saying this doesn't happen. It rarely happens. But for whatever reason, our default setting is this abject failure. In reality, failure comes to what I call CVP failure. And CVP failure, it's common. There's versions. It evolves. Sometimes it can be predicted. It obviously should be constructive because we're learning from it. And sometimes even, I dare say, it's strategic. As a director, I have signed off on ideas from my staff who have said, we don't know if this will work. And I say, well, let's go find out. And based off of that, we are now strategizing. If we fail, what next? This type of failure is methodical, sometimes intentional. Sometimes we have to throw things against the wall just to see if they stick. And there's nothing wrong with that. Because we're not going to hit the bullseye every time. Chances are we're going to miss the bullseye quite often. Now, I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, but when Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, after 1,000 tries, a journalist said to him, "Don't you see yourself as a failure? It took you 1,000 tries to build a light bulb." And Edison purportedly retorts, but don't you see, sir, I only learned one way to make a light bulb, but I learned 999 ways how not to." That's reframing. That's learning from failure. That is embracing failure. Again, in my leadership philosophy, I'm never going to be upset about failing, but I'll get very upset and disappointed if we don't learn from our failure. Because if we're not learning, if we're not growing, then what are we doing? Again, we're not a place that says nothing, be nothing, or does nothing. We're a place that expands. We're a place that explores those maybe dangerous peripheries because we don't know what's out there. And we need to be eager to learn what is and what could be. Failure is normal. Failure is part of who we are. And it has to be articulated in that manner. Failure is not the opposite of success. It is part of success. We have to try and fail and try and fail and try and fail in order to find success. Sometimes we're lucky. And I love those times when we're lucky and we try and we find success right away. But I would argue that's not the norm. I would argue that we have to go through failure, not around it, in order to find success. I would argue that we don't find success as often because we're afraid to fail. Failure will not define us completely, nor should it. It should be part of our definition. It should be part of the larger strategic map, but it starts with leadership. And as I already stated, each and every single one of you is a leader within your organization. A title does not say you're a leader. The size of your office does not say you're a leader. The zeros behind your paycheck does not say you are a leader. It's what you exude in your own actions is what makes you a leader. And by embracing failure, by having it become part of your leadership strategy, by having it part of your team's strategy, you become stronger. You become willing to explore those areas that you may not have thought were possible before. Today's presentation was us finding success in failure. I have not shared any real big, earth-shattering original ideas. It's come through reframing, rethinking, strategizing, and understanding that every failure is not catastrophic. The catastrophic failures do happen. And when those happen, there's nothing that we can do about it. But if we have the default setting that every failure is going to be catastrophic, it's going to be pushing water uphill in whatever endeavor that you do for a long, long time. There's no reason to have that default setting. Learn from failure. Embrace failure. Have failure become part of your organization, as part of your personal growth. Because through that, again, we'll find success. Thank you very much for your time this morning, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Gavin, this presentation was really wonderful. I feel so inspired now. I think we sometimes need a reminder that failure is not the end and that it's not even to not be expected.
Absolutely. I think failure is usually the best leaping off point to success.
I agree.
Chris asks, any book recommendations? I do have a few book recommendations, actually. A few of them may not be what you would typically think. First one is called Wait, What? By James E. Ryan, former Dean of Harvard's Graduate School of Education. And this book asks 5 essential questions that you should be asking yourself every day in different endeavors that you do that address failure, address strategy, address leadership. The other series of books, one that I particularly like, Think Like a Freak by Stephen Levitt and Stephen Dubner. You probably know them more from their Freakonomics books. Failures, as I said, I spent a big portion of failure, or today's presentation, about reframing failure. These books absolutely help you kind of, energize your brain to think differently, to explore those variables that maybe led up to the failure and understanding them differently from a different lens, a different perspective. Another one is Contagious by Jonah Berger. This is all about understanding why things catch on or why things don't catch on and why we fail. And finally, for the academic librarians, Hacking the Academy, the new approaches to digital scholarship teaching, digital humanities, why things, again, catch on, why they fail. And then one book that I recently read with my management team, Five Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni, which addresses why failure really is not only the obstacle, but the monster that basically consumes a team or maybe makes a team toxic.
I don't see anybody else typing, so I think we are set for today. Gavin, I wanted to thank you again for your amazing presentation. I know we have all come out of it with a new perspective for failure and trying new things. Absolutely.
You're very welcome.